Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA and Chair of the Urbanism Division, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, March 31st, and we will be hearing the presentation, Enabling Access to Public Spaces to Advance Economic, Environmental, and Social Benefits. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call the 1-800 number shown. And for your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those in the questions box, again located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. And we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. Thanks to all of the participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you don't see your chapter or division listed, please consider reaching out to your division or chapter leadership and ask them to join us. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Urban Design and Preservation Division, which we'll learn a little bit more about in a moment. And you can visit planning.org/divisions to learn about all of our divisions. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. You can register for these by visiting our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, just head over to planning.org and log into your MyAPA account. And then you can search for CM activities up at the top in the search bar, either by entering today's title, webcast title, or the event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education credit, and you can check that out again at our webcast webpage. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. We are recording today's webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel. You can just search Planning Webcast on YouTube and it'll pop up. And a PDF of the PowerPoint will also be available at the end of the presentation on our webcast webpage. Again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Now I'm going to turn it over to Margaret Rifkin of the Urban Design and Preservation Division to kick us off. Margaret.
Thanks, Christine. Hi, I'm Margaret Rifkin, as Christine said, and we're hosting today's webinar. First, we invite you to join us. We have a great group. We are a very big division, and we've got a great leadership group. Please come join us, come volunteer. At the moment, we are especially interested in those of you who enjoy working on social media and marketing. And we're also interested in folks who would like to create features for our newsletter with cutting-edge content, either written or images. And if you're interested, you can use the question box on your screen today and send us a message right now, and we'll contact you later. If you'll be in New York for the APA conference, please come by and say hello to us. We'd like to meet you. The best time is at our reception, which is Saturday night. It will be at FX Fowle Architects, so check your programs, or come to one of the sessions we're sponsoring. We have something on every day of the conference. So we hope to meet you there. Today is the inaugural webinar of our 2017 series. I suspect that all of you have, like me, hunted for images on the internet to use in your work. Our next webinar after today will be on the Creative Commons, and you'll hear about how that was formed and how to use it to your advantage, either to use other people's work or put your work out there for folks to use. Then in July, we're going to hear from an expert on placemaking in public art. Paula worked on Santana Row and also is most recently working on Pike and Rose with Federal Realty and has done some fabulous work with a whole spectrum of artists creating placemaking or doing placemaking in these locations. Now, if you're like me, you use your smartphone constantly, and Christine will move us to the next slide in a second. I've taken a course on smartphone photography and learned all kinds of cool things that my smartphone did that I never imagined. So we wanted to bring to you a webinar on smartphone photography with a professional photographer. So that'll be in September. And in November, we're looking at Path as Place, which is a concept developed by Cindy Zerger, who's at Tool Design Group. They are a national firm that specializes specifically in all types of pathways, from bikeways to hiker-biker trails, and they are going to sponsor that webinar. So that being said, we're ready for the main course. I am delighted to introduce Patricia ODonnell. She's a preservation landscape architect, a planner, and an urban conservation expert. Patricia founded Heritage Landscapes 30 years ago, and with her talented group of folks, including her colleagues and team members and clients, the firm has successfully completed over 500 projects and garnered countless professional awards. She's worked on projects that involved a wide spectrum of resources of both international and national distinction. And I was looking at her website, and her firm's website, and then I was fascinated. She's worked on the Woodstock Festival cultural landscape, earthworks at West Point from the Revolutionary War, as well as resources associated with the civil rights movement in Birmingham, Alabama, not to mention her international work. So I am delighted to welcome Patricia.
Thank you for the generous introduction, much appreciated, and for the invitation to do the webinar. We tend in our daily life to focus on opportunities and issues that are in our everyday needs. So in this webinar, I'm interested in exploring with you some international directives that can augment our local issues and aid in our planning and partnering efforts. I start here with a scene from the Cathedral Square in Manila, which is in Intramuros. I was able to do a team project with the World Bank on uplifting Intramuros, and found a number of aspects of it to relate to the inclusive qualities of public space. So let me start with a couple of ideas. Heritage is basically all that we inherit. It's tangible and intangible. It integrates local values. It can happen at multiple levels. We're all familiar with National Register listings, National Landmark, and World Heritage, but there's often quite a bit of urban heritage that's unrecognized and uninventoried, and helps to foster social cohesion, integrate diverse populace and diverse value systems, and urban heritage is a cultural, social, economic, and environmental asset. And in recent years, I've continued to use the term asset rather than resource, because it helps with partnering when people realize that public space has an economic value as well as a social, cultural, and environmental value. So we often think of culture in kind of a narrow way, and we say, oh, well, that's about art museums or something somewhat simplistic, or local craft or local economy and handwork. But UNESCO fosters a broader definition: spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features of a society encompassing value systems, traditions, and beliefs. So if we think about culture that way, we're talking culture big picture, and what we're interested in is the unique aspects of local cultures and the value systems, traditions, and beliefs that they express in daily life. So within that context, our inheritance of urban public spaces is a shared cultural asset. We're all familiar with the environment, economy, society triad that shapes sustainability. What we've been hearing in recent years is maybe culture should be the fourth pillar within sustainability. My approach and concept that I speak to whenever I have the opportunity is that culture permeates because it influences aspects of environment, economy, and society, and heritage as a set of assets sustains those aspects of contemporary life. It's an easy shift to go from this model over to a capital model and indicate that heritage assets are a part of our cultural capital. So as a little background, I think it's useful to trace some selected international guidance on culture and nature, because what we're talking about today is inclusive public space and its benefits. So if you begin, you can choose a number of places to begin, but if you begin in 1972 with the World Heritage Convention, where we are today is 193 countries have signed on, which makes that convention one of the most appreciated and respected laws on the planet. In 1976, the UNESCO Recommendation concerning the safeguarding and contemporary role of historic areas was put forward, and interestingly, the next major statement on urban aspects was 2011. So you look at this stretch from 76 to 2011, many changes in those nearly 4 decades. Some of you may be familiar with the ICOMOS Charter on Historic Towns and Urban Areas, often called the Washington Charter. The cultural landscapes were brought forward for inscription in World Heritage in '92, and that changed the nature of the World Heritage List to a degree. We now have a huge number of cultural landscape listings, and that was parallel to the United Nations working forward with the Convention on Biological Diversity and the broader recognition of the concept of IUCN's protected areas. IUCN is the World Conservation Union. And then speaking to cities, ICOMOS put forward the Xi'an Declaration on the Conservation of Settings and Urban Heritage Structures and Sites in 2005. I was engaged in that work and then have been engaged from 2005 in the development of this UNESCO recommendation on the historic urban landscape with a number of colleagues, some of whom you may know, like Jeff Sewell at APA International Office. In 2005, UNESCO put forward the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the international agenda for the next 15 years, called the 2030 Agenda. And then following it in 2016, we had Habitat 3 and the new Urban Agenda. So if we back up and look at these a bit, just for key words, UNESCO World Heritage Convention is about culture and nature, the heritage of both, as the heritage of humankind as a whole, and puts forward the international community to participate in the protection of culture and natural heritage due to its outstanding universal value, which means its importance beyond state, party, country boundaries. There are 1,052 World Heritage Sites. 814 of these are culture, which gives you a sense of the values that people are holding, that a substantial percentage, 80% of the World Heritage Sites are those listed for culture. And it's about, as I mentioned earlier, mutual respect, and it fosters peace. So the World Heritage Site doesn't give you a map like this anymore, but this one that I clipped in 2005 gives you a sense of the distribution of World Heritage Sites across the planet, and that many of these are in human settlements as identified and defined by the United Nations as a city, town, or village, a density at any scale. Interestingly, there are 571 listings, but within those listings, 1,631 human settlements are inscribed. And that number was one that we came up with in a study that I worked with colleagues on in 2015 for the World Heritage Center. So if we look at this recommendation concerning the safeguarding and contemporary role of historic areas in 76, we have this notion of historic areas as a part of the daily environment that foster and match the diversity of society, and that as a policy, we should be safeguarding and adapting them to modern requirements. So this statement, a quote out of the 76, really brings us into the planning profession, and that then those policies should influence ongoing planning at all levels. So the reason I give you some of these words is that you can use them. You can take these kinds of quotes out of particular aspects of international guidance and apply them locally and apply the concepts in a way that people feel like they're part of the larger picture. The Convention on Biological Diversity was one that brings us to the IUCN protected area categories. Looking at these categories, starting with strict nature all the way down to sustainable use of natural resources, particularly supporting local traditions. Category 5, protected landscape and seascape, is the largest. Note in this sample from the USA, 83% of our protected areas are basically parks and local resources. So if you think about the protected areas of the planet, and I'm showing this particular map. Some of you may not be familiar with the IUCN Protected Planet website. You might want to look at that. Interestingly, globally, there are between 12 and 14% of terrestrial areas and a lower percentage, usually under 3, of marine areas. But again, taking an example from the US, we've added a lot of marine areas, particularly recently under President Obama, this East Coast area, the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, and these areas in Alaska. So we're leading the way in marine protection. And I think that you may be interested to understand a bit more about protected planet. So the 2011 UNESCO Recommendation on the Historic Urban Landscape is an international soft law. The basic concept is heritage and development can be compatible and cooperative. So let me just say that again, because we often find that heritage and development are at odds. And this soft law basically says heritage and development compatible and cooperative. You might want to look this up, the UNESCO recommendation on the historic urban landscape. There's a lot of good narrative in it, and there are 4 tool groups: civic engagement, knowledge and planning, regulatory systems, and financial tools. These are interrelated, and they thrive in atmospheres of good governance, and I think that in the planning professions, we're very good at the second group of tools, knowledge and planning. We often have civic engagement as a part of our daily work and regulatory systems, but we need to find partners to be able to embrace all 4 of those tool groups to be effective going forward in the fast-paced world of the 21st century. 2015, UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals were adopted at the United Nations. If some of you saw the Pope's talk in September of 2015, immediately following it was the adoption of this 2030 agenda. And just in context, this followed on the Millennia Goals, and the Millennial Goals 15 years earlier addressed aspects like poverty, hunger, health and well-being, which have some reference to the planning professions, not perhaps central. But this particular agenda, if you read the titles, decent work and economic growth, reducing inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, you start to see that we're really looking at a much more inclusive and comprehensive way forward. This is an international agenda, and the ideas are, instead of, as the millennial goals were, nice laudatory ideas, they actually also have 169 measurable targets. They're working on that measurement process now, and that for 15 years the global action will move in these directions. So for example, a lot of attention in the planning profession at Habitat 3 and elsewhere has been focused on this goal 11, but goal 3, good health and well-being, ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all at all ages, and goal 15, life on land, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, halt and reverse land degradation, just begin to give you a flavor of some of the other aspects of these goals. There was a study that I located on the UNESCO SDGs website searches that looks at the interrelationships between these goals, and the diagram shows a series of direct connections between and among the Sustainable Development Goals. And culture and heritage relate to many of these SDGs. So goal 11 is the one that is getting a considerable amount of focus and was certainly the forefront goal at Habitat 3 last October. And it is about making cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Goal 11.4 is key to this particular division of APA because it focuses on cultural and natural heritage. 11.7 is the reference for what we're talking about today, which indicates by 2030 the objective of providing universal access to safe, inclusive, and accessible green and public spaces, in particular for women, children, older persons, and persons with disabilities. And then 11.8, supporting positive economic, social, and environmental links between urban, peri-urban, and rural areas, and strengthening national and regional development planning. We all know that the isolation of any given urban, peri-urban, or rural area is melting in the kind of life and pace of the 21st century. And partnerships are clearly a key element. And 11.9 that indicates that by 2020, that's now only 3 years away, policies and plans toward inclusion, resource efficiency, mitigation, adaptation to climate change, and resilience to disasters are to be brought forward at all levels, local, regional, national, and international. So I'm sure many of you know about it, but you might want to look up the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is a holistic disaster risk management framework. So I've been involved through my ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Cultural Landscapes with this Connecting Practices initiative of IUCN and ICOMOS. And in that work, there's been some models brought forward, and I've been working on this one to look at the relationships between natural habitats and human-shaped habitats for biological diversity, and tangible heritage and intangible heritage for cultural diversity. And this model in particular recognizes that culture and nature are entangled and inseparable. So the long-term Western idea that nature is somewhere else and we are apart from it is a barrier to our ability to have sustainable cities, and is an idea that needs to be assigned to the past. So in particular, culture and nature are required to be embraced if we're going to reach inclusivity, social justice, resilience, climate change, and all the other needs that are pressing on our human settlements of all sizes and types. Quality public spaces and urban biodiversity must increase for cities to prosper as healthy, just settlements. So moving to October of last year, the UN Habitat 3 and the New Urban Agenda, there were a lot of people at Quito. They posted 30,000. There were lots of crowds. I'm not sure what there were 30,000 there, but it was big. And there are 175 paragraphs to the New Urban Agenda with many, many commitments. The central one is to leave no one behind. And a couple of key points drawing on that, by readdressing the way cities and human settlements are planned, designed, financed, developed, governed, and managed, the New Urban Agenda will help to end poverty and hunger, reduce inequalities, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, achieve gender equality, empower women and girls, improve human health and well-being, foster resilience, and protect the environment. So this is a huge agenda, clearly, and it is a sidecar and an integrated work with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The key themes are social justice, inclusivity, health, safety, and with heritage and culture recognized as assets and enablers within that matrix. So the question for us today is, where do public spaces fit? And they fit as inclusive and democratic, the shared city of streets, squares, plazas, riverfronts, parks, urban forests, and more. Two particular excerpts from the New Urban Agenda, paragraphs 37 and 38, mirror the UN SDGs 11.7 and 11.4, and in general the goal 11 on sustainable cities and communities. So the language throughout is this commitment language, but the idea here is to promote safe, inclusive, accessible, green, and quality public spaces in all their diversity, and then to ensure human development to build peaceful, inclusive, and participatory societies. So public spaces are seen as a platform for peace, inclusivity, and participation. And then in paragraph 38, we commit ourselves to sustainable leveraging of natural and cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, in cities and human settlements, to safeguard and promote cultural infrastructures and sites, to revitalize urban areas in strengthening social participation and the exercise of citizenship. My particular involvement with Habitat 3 was through the UNESCO Culture Urban Future Global Report on Culture for Sustainable Urban Development. It was launched at Habitat in October. There were many contributors. The goals related to the SDGs are several, and in particular, in a global context, unprecedented levels of urbanization and the preservation and quality of urban life, the protection of urban identities, and the valuing of local cultures sees creative expression in industries, arts, and heritage as both enablers and drivers. So culture should be considered a catalyst for mixed-use, human-scale cities that integrate cultural and natural resources in order to be sustainable. This is the table of contents, essentially, of this report, and it speaks to the UN SDGs and where heritage and creativity enter. It looks at the 8 regions of the world and does a regional analysis of the global state of culture and heritage. And then there are 3 themes and 4 papers each: people, environment, and policies. with 12 recommendations coming forward, 4 in each of the 3 areas. So my work was the lead article on Chapter 7, Inclusive Public Spaces, and some of the key foci of that are that cultural heritage assets for all citizens foster social inclusion, and vibrant public spaces should be accessible to all. Public spaces should be respected and upgraded and supported by adequate resources as protected areas inherited from prior generations that can be integral to the creative expression and the transmission of practices of a diverse urban population. That parks and protected areas within and near a city contribute to its climate change resilience, and that regenerating and upgrading public spaces in low-income areas of cities can foster social justice and equity. The research on this last point indicates that in general, all areas in low-income or in informal portions of cities are really very much without quality public space, or in fact any public space. So upgrading and building new public space in low-income areas of cities is a big part of our ability to move toward a socially just society. So the New Urban Agenda, paragraph 14, environmental sustainability, looks at protecting ecosystems and adopting healthy lifestyles in harmony with nature, but has a limited environmental focus. Interestingly, the voice of the New Urban Agenda, or NUA, is people-based language, and it places nature in the service to humanity, undervaluing nature. I think this is a tradition in our Western literature that goes back several hundred years, but it's something of a mindset that we need to certainly be aware of and hopefully address toward rebalancing if we expect to sustain the planet. So here I'm listing some of the buttons from the Sustainable Development Goals to show that when we're talking about nature and cities, it's climate action, and life below water, life on land, and peace, justice, and strong institutions, among others of the UN SDGs. And this is a view of Rio de Janeiro with the Tijuca Forest with 7,000 acres, 2,300 hectares of green space that backs up the city of Rio. I had the privilege of working with a group of colleagues at the Culture Ministry in 2009 to frame the World Heritage nomination for Rio, and one of the key aspects was this relationship of sea to the massifs, these uprisings of geological form, particularly this one with the Cristo, which is such an international icon, and the relationship to these 7,000 acres of dark green forest that frame the city. So public open spaces are critical to social, environmental, and economic assets, and they can uplift the quality of urban life, health, and well-being. As the commons shared by city dwellers, public open spaces offer multiple and diverse benefits. But as I mentioned, poor areas equal poor public spaces. Our common heritage of public spaces are cultural and natural assets, and they address many of the UN SDGs and their individual targets as urban cultural diversity and biodiversity are enhanced. So here the matrix is good health and well-being, quality education, more and more of which is also linked to the outdoors, to farm to table, to good food in schools, to experience of nature, to school playgrounds being turned into school environments, gender equality, reduced inequalities in general, the all standard goal 11 on sustainable cities and communities, climate action, life below water, on land, and the partnerships for goals. But many of these complex ways forward require diverse partnerships. So here I'm giving an example of from a photo I took from the roof of Humayun's tomb, looking at the urban forest of Delhi, India. And in this case, the Aga Khan Foundation did its work on the historic site, but they combined it with a neighborhood uplift series of projects that included employment at a nursery, learning skills, and being able to grow plants for use in the urban setting. Another example of inclusive public spaces and the urban commons is this one, where in Pittsburgh, the original Schenley Plaza, early 20th century, had a green space in the middle and plenty of cars, became a parking lot, and then was recaptured as a commons with the loss of really not a large count of parking spaces in the University Hub area of Pittsburgh. So inclusive public spaces are accessible to all, well used and enjoyed, effectively stewarded and managed through good governance and community engagement. And inclusivity includes that kind of community engagement at several levels, through planning, through decision making, through implementation and management. Interestingly, at Quito, I was asked a question about that aspect of co-management that is becoming very popular, and the dialogue that ensued between the questioner, another member of the audience, and myself was about how co-management can be a cop-out by the city that puts the burden for managing public space on the people without the resources to do it, or can be appropriately framed through a good agreement in a way that includes and supports and sustains the community while the public space is well managed. Inclusive benefits of from the social aspect of public spaces include this engagement in plans, decisions, and managing, democratic access, places for free speech and dialogue, the commons for social interaction that move us toward social cohesion and tolerance, the fostering of cultural traditions and practices, the increasing of new neighborhood pride and belonging, and aid us in addressing inequalities in general and improving social justice, and give the right to the city. There's been quite a bit of discussion about rights, and one of these is the right to be a citizen and to be able to feel that this is your city. So there is a focus needed on new and enhanced public space in low-income areas. This is a simulation that we're showing that we did for our work in Jackson Park, which is a project collaboration. I'll show you who those folks are later, but this is the current state of the place where everyone goes to fish, and here is the proposed way that it would work and be more inclusive and work better for the activities people wish to undertake. At Quito, for about 6 months in advance of the meeting, we worked with ICOMOS, through ICOMOS and US ICOMOS, with the Patrimony Office in the historic city of Quito and with the community of Vive Alameda. And interestingly, the community identified their valued places. These are the places that they identified. And among them, several of the key ones, these first 4, are all in the park that is adjacent to the neighborhood. So La Alameda Park was valued by everyone as a shared heritage and inclusive public space that fosters social justice and participation. And their hope as a community in the time we were together and worked in advance of Quito was about improving the park, both its heritage and its function for the contemporary neighborhood. So some of the key aspects that can help here are good health and well-being, the ability to use the park for education, to be in places that foster gender equality, to generally reduce inequalities and to work toward a sustainable city. So the view from the neighborhood, it's all steep slopes. This doesn't have an escalier, a heavy stair, but it's all downhill. That's the park, and here is the park with folks enjoying their day. Recognizing in the community forum that the next steps were to accept and to embrace the entanglement of culture and nature for the historic park today, for a better life and better quality of life. As an example, at Jackson Park, we looked at this entanglement of culture and nature in a historic Olmsted landscape of note. Many of you will recall it as the site of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. And the issue for us in this project was habitat integration while recognizing the National Register status of the park as a historic Olmsted designed landscape. We were able to review in great detail the Olmsted firm work in 1895, immediately after the fair, and found that they did probably the United States' first brownfield project. Knowing that there were 200 buildings demolished, their plans included soils plans for the areas that were to be planted. So we think we're on the cutting edge, but there's an 1895 brownfield project. What we were working on here was to uplift the park as a commonwealth and its adjacent neighborhoods through improvement with the park. The park is in the south side of Chicago in the areas that are the hotspots for local crime. And the opportunity here of making the park easier to move through, more visually permeable and safer, allowed people to move into the park and enjoy the park. The project respected both heritage and nature. We were connecting the disentangled and unconnected pieces of the park that had changed over time, providing scenic overlooks for the kind of experience of a public space that you can't get in the city. A long view over a water body framed in forest is something that is, by evidence in research, something that helps our health and well-being. And upgrading these park areas and facilities focused on diverse use and broad access. And the intent was to accommodate traffic, but to limit noise and to limit movements through the park. We were able in the project that was really all about habitat, funded by the Army Corps, Great Lakes fisheries and habitat money sources, to put together 1.4 additional miles of paths and 6 overlooks that would allow people broader access to this 600-some acre park and enjoyment of it along the edge of Lake Michigan, as well as having a ripple effect into the neighborhood. In relationship to environmental benefits, some of the key ones are improving air quality, reducing climate change impacts, quelling urban heat island, managing stormwater, particularly an issue with climate change, with all of our storm activity being fast, flashy flows and high volumes of water in short numbers of hours, and also to provide habitat for resident and migratory species. So you'll recognize the location of this photo. We were a member of a large team headed by HOK on the restoration of turf and soils at the National Mall, and this is the first phase of the project that was completed a couple of years ago, that basically looked at how we can turn this into a greener landscape. So in this example of turf and soil restoration, one of the things we did was research internationally. We have 25 million pairs of feet on this space every year, and we didn't find anywhere on Earth a softscape that had that kind of traffic. So The big picture was to reinforce the long green space from the Capitol over to the Washington Monument, which is in the next block right here off 15th Street. And this particular view is taken from the top of the Washington Monument, looking at the work of the second phase underway, which was completed in December of 2016. So what did we do? Improve soils for percolation, aid compaction resistance, regrade the gentle slopes so that we were able to discourage foot traffic on the lawn to a degree, add curbs and drains, harvest the rainwater in new large cisterns, and irrigate the lawns with filtered rainwater. So this project yielded a green front lawn for the United States. So the economic benefits of inclusive public space include improved public health, increased resilience, provision of ecological services, upgrading neighborhoods, increasing property values, spurring investments, and providing employment. And you'll notice that this group of the SDG buttons are not the blues and the greens, but decent work in economic growth, Goal 9, industry, Goal 10, inequalities, and Goal 11, sustainable cities. These are two images from Mellon Square, a project we completed 2 years ago. And this example for the Mellon Square renewal restored a 1955 modernist masterpiece by Simons & Simons and Mitchell and Ritchie. It helped revitalize Pittsburgh, created a positive economic impact. The project was $7 million in construction, and the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy, our client and partner in this work, brought together an endowment of $4 million. And at the time that I last researched it, it had generated over $300 million of adjacent investments. It improved the quality of public space to increase downtown vitality, and it really was a historic city urban uplift through restoring the heritage of a valued public square. In addition, we were able to do an interpretive panel on the front of the street fronts that are immediately below this new terrace that added 17% of space to the public plaza. And our partnership with the Pittsburgh Park Conservancy had a whole host of partners in Pittsburgh that they worked with, and both public and private, principally private funding on this particular project. So the example of thinking about planning in general, I think really reflects on how we think about public space now as part of the warp and weft of cloth of cities. We were able in 2001 to work with a team to build the master plan, the first master plan for these 4 large regional parks, and then in 2015 to again bring much of the team together and look at where we could go with these parks after a series of uplift projects on the 4 parks. So the issue of the Parks Conservancy leadership here in planning and in projects is that we were able a couple of years ago in this plan to envision the 1,800 acres of historic regional parks as cornerstones of a vibrant, sustainable city, as integrated elements in the green, blue, gray networks that permeate Pittsburgh and connect from parks along streets, trails, rivers, and neighborhoods, to bring forward a park system as a health foundation to sustainable culture, environment, economy, and society, and to foster the enduring partnership between the Conservancy and NGO, the city, and the citizens. So the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy, together with the city, community, and a number of important partners, have addressed in the regional parks projects and undertakings and been able to fund over $100 million of work over a period of 20 years There's much more to be done, but these parks are considerably improved, made considerably more accessible and successful as places for people in order to make the city a more equitable and democratic place. So with that, I thank you for listening and welcome your questions. I would stress that the UNESCO Hull, the UN SDGs, and the United Nations New Urban Agenda are an opportunity for integration, and that they sit at the intersection of culture and nature in human settlements, and that a healthy environment is a human right. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Patricia. Okay, remember you can ask your questions by typing them in the chat box in your GoToWebinar tool panel. First question, is that a parking garage under Mellon Square?
Absolutely. It was the first plaza above a parking garage. It's 6 layers, several hundred cars, and it raised some interesting technical issues for our work because there's a jurisdictional boundary at the waterproofing barrier.
Great, that's very clever. Next question, why have they stopped updating the map of World Heritage Sites?
Oh, they haven't. It's just that now you have to look at a country or look at an area at a time, and you can't get that overall world map to show up. At least I haven't. Maybe somebody else can go to the World Heritage website and find a way to show all the World Heritage sites at once, but I haven't been able to do it for a few years since they changed to Earth View model.
Okay, wonderful. I always say this, sometimes we get a whole ton of questions and sometimes we don't get any. And usually it's if your presentation is so comprehensive and everyone is trying to think really hard about what you've said, they have a hard time coming up with questions, which happens to be today. There's one other question I think a couple people have been asking. ICOMOS.
ICOMOS.
Yes.
The International Council on Monuments and Sites. So let's back up for a minute. What is that? World Heritage, established in 1972, has 3 partners. 1 partner on education, 1 partner on culture, and 1 partner on nature. The partners are, for education, ICROM, based in Rome. For culture, ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, based in Paris. And for nature, IUCN, the World Conservation Union, based in Gland, Switzerland. So when you think about nature, culture, and education, those are the 3 partners with World Heritage globally.
Perfect. Thank you. We had a couple of those questions.
So just to push that a little bit more, I don't know how many of the folks who are with us today are actually ICOMOS members, but through US ICOMOS membership at the international level, which is not inexpensive but less expensive than being an APA member, you can access the international scientific committees. There are 25 of them, and you can participate and learn from and exchange with global colleagues. And I would suggest to you, if you have an interest in paying attention to or being engaged in international activities, ICOMOS is a really good method to do that.
Now we have a bunch of questions coming through. Okay. How has gender equality expressed in any of the projects that you've worked on?
Well, I think in public space, the issue of gender equality is a really important one. In the United States, in contemporary society, I think our diversity of society, including our populations that grew up in other countries in the world or have brought different customs with them, we need to think carefully about public space and the qualities that would make it welcoming. So for the work in Jackson Park, for example, I think our interest was in a sense of personal safety and security, with the ability to see and be seen, with the ability to move through a fairly dense and green landscape in a way that you would not become fearful for your well-being. So I think that for women in particular in society and girls, I think the need to feel safe is an important one that is a benchmark of our work in public parks.
Thank you. Next question. Many of the communities in Michigan are struggling to meet basic infrastructure needs. How do you present need for public space to elected leaders who are struggling with the financial reality?
Yeah, this is always a tough one because everyone knows that the cost of public space is being borne by communities. Interestingly, where we've found the greatest success is places like Pittsburgh, Louisville, and several others, notably, of course, you all know New York City, where conservancies have stepped up and taken a partnership role. I think that what is needed in most communities is an advocacy voice, and the advocacy voice needs to be well orchestrated. So while a friends of group can have a certain influence on a particular park, once you actually grow up a bit from your friends group and become an NGO, a 501c3, and are able to partner with local and regional philanthropy and bring skill sets to the uplifting of parks, the city begins to see that there is a way for parks to be improved. The question also reminds me of an example from Chile. I met a few years ago at an International Federation of Landscape Architects meeting a young man who founded a group called Mi Parque. And his objective after getting out of architecture school was to help people fix up their environments in areas of poverty. I checked a couple of years of work and saw that now he had, and his team has grown, he has been able to complete more than 200 projects in Chile, bringing together funding from numerous sources and empowering people by handing them shovels, bringing in trees, and beginning to uplift poor areas in particular. The interesting result of that kind of hands-on work is the sense of the people in those neighborhoods that it is theirs. What we have found in some neighborhoods is that if something is given to the neighborhood, it can be a target for vandalism. It's also an interesting issue because why should the better neighborhoods get free trees and the poor neighborhoods have to plant their own? So you have these interesting conundrums that you have to think through in order to justify and feel that the work that you're undertaking is empowering.
You started to hit on a point that we've had a couple of questions come through about gentrification. Do you have any other comments regarding the concerns of gentrification when upgrading public spaces in low-income communities?
Yes, I think that's a really interesting and complicated issue for planners. There's been a couple of communities that have tried to develop community land trusts to have a second group of potential control within the real estate market. I know that in Chicago there was a lot of discussion when I was there a lot 2 years ago about having the South Side neighborhoods around the University of Chicago have a agreement with the city about neighborhood uplift that would help quell gentrification with the Obama Library going in there. I think that we have very few good examples of how to work through improvement without having the unintended effect of having the residents be forced out by gentrification. I think it's a really fertile and important field, and we should share the best examples more widely so that we can all learn from them.
Okay, thank you. Next question. So what are the main funding sources for these types of studies and projects? Are we talking nonprofit, or is there actually like local or state funds or even national funds that are available?
The projects that I showed you are diversely funded. If we want to look at the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy, their funding stream began from private sources and contributed as it grew with more public sources. The way I posed it to them years ago when we first started the pilot projects was that they had to think of funding as a quilt, that there had to be usually several pieces. And I recall a project we did on the welcome entry at Highland Park to rebuild a derelict, filled-in turn-of-the-century fountain and build the gardens around it, that we had 7 different funding sources and 7 small parts of the project to be built out in order to get it completed. And the creativity required is one aspect, but the track record is the other. So an entity like the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy or the partnership between Metro Parks in Louisville and the Louisville Olmsted Parks Conservancy, or the Central Park Conservancy and its arrangements with the city, and probably more realistically for many people, the Prospect Park Alliance and how it has worked in Brooklyn. All of these models are really helpful in thinking through how funding is really in components, and that funding, when it's demonstrating its success, can generate more funding. So I'm recalling a discussion by the historian of the city of Cuba, who some of you may have heard over the years, and what he talked about was his first project was a couple of $1,000 or pesos, and that incrementing forward, fixing a hotel for occupancy and organizing the agreement for that historic hotel so that the funds would go back into the city historian's coffers in order to be used for another project, basically created a pyramid over the years so that more and more important projects could be undertaken.
Okay, thank you. Next question. For communities with fewer resources, finding stewards and creating a realistic maintenance plan has often been the highest hurdle. Do you have any recommendations for either design or management that makes the maintenance less of a burden?
That's an interesting and very important question. In much of our planning work addressing important landscapes, significant historic landscapes, one of the components is developing a management calendar and plan that aligns to the preservation values and character, and at the same time addresses a lower level of staff, FTEs, full-time equivalent workers, and a quality of space that people want to be in at the same time that it is less maintenance intensive. So, for example, we have worked through the level of FTE per acre running from highly tended garden with annuals down to forests. So a healthy woodland requires one person per 10 acres per year if you want it to maintain its health. A beautiful garden requires 2.5 people per acre. So you're looking at that kind of relationship. If you look at the landscape type, you can see the maintenance intensity. So one of the things we found in public spaces is that over time they often get more and more gardens. Sometimes there's a garden volunteer group that pays attention to and takes care of those. Sometimes that's a cyclic process and that volunteer group disappears after a period of time. So one key aspect is to limit the high touch, high care spaces while at the same time working on the habitat aspects. In a way, the whole recognition and increased understanding among the general public about the need for habitat for insects, for birds, is helping, because we're moving away to a degree from the highly tended garden to the naturalistic butterfly meadow. How do you fit that butterfly meadow into the historic environment? Well, that was essentially our target at Jackson Park. Where is short, well-tended plant material needed to provide and communicate the Olmsted character, and where can we have little bluestem and native flowering plants that will support the insects and the birds. So I think that this notion of moving away from the highly tended and toward the native is one that can really help us with maintenance. That isn't to say that any new landscape being shifted into a new typology is low care initially. It is not. 2 to 3 years of establishment care are required so that the idea of lower care in the future can be achieved. The work at Jackson Park is actually a 5-year contract. The plantings finished by year 2.5, and the last 2.5 years in ongoing care so that everything is well established. So that kind of an approach, which is a higher upfront capital cost, but puts the landscape, the public landscape, on a stronger footing toward a maintainability, is something that could also be considered.
Thank you. Next question. The many wonderful examples of inclusive public spaces that you cite are worked on often in cultural Western places. Are there very different considerations for non-Western public spaces? For example, how does inclusive public space differ in Middle Eastern, African, or Indian cultures?
My Middle Eastern experience is based on travel and some professional volunteer work, but I would suggest that inclusive public spaces in the Mideast and some that I investigated for that chapter on inclusive public spaces in Culture Urban Future highlighted the aspect of having female and male spaces with a degree of privacy in order for women to share the space and engage with each other in a social interaction within the restrictions of dress and proper behaviors. So there are considerable differences globally. In China, I have not seen gender-based differences, but I think that the public spaces around Westlake, for example, a World Heritage Site, are well used and quite crowded. So some of the issue, one that we haven't necessarily raised, is when you really have successful inclusive public spaces, it can be overused, and that overuse causes its own series of maintenance, care, and ongoing quality issues.
Okay, thank you. This is an interesting angle. How do you view the role of health impact assessments in the topic of your presentation, and what is being done, if anything, to promote use of HIAs to further the goals and objectives of what you've presented about?
It would be great if the questioner gave us some examples of health impact assessments. I'm familiar with heritage impact assessments. I know that health impact assessments exist, but I think that what I found in looking at the research was that some of our best opportunities for better urban health were with urban forests and urban public spaces that were accessible. So the baseline might be understanding the environmental and social health of the existing public spaces and doing a health impact assessment at the city or neighborhood level to look at what kind of health impact the public spaces in the diverse socioeconomic levels of neighborhoods might bring forward.
Okay. I think we'll take one last question here. If you could, we're going to go back to Mellon Square, and if you could elaborate on the jurisdictional boundary and the water barrier.
Oh, well, City Parks was responsible for everything above the waterproofing layer, and the Pittsburgh Parking Authority was responsible for everything below the waterproofing layer. So in the 1955 original plan, let me go back to the image. This pool, the original very beautiful pool with a cantilevered edge about 12 inches off the ground, the entire edge was replaced with a hard edge with granite on it. And we had to rebuild that entire fountain in high density concrete, fiber reinforced, very few joints and openings. As you see, it's quite elaborate in terms of the water display and the lighting display. So in building that, we were restricted to all the inflow, outflow openings that existed historically. So that's a pretty interesting technical challenge because, of course, water supply and drainage and electrical supply and everything else, we needed a lot of feeds in and out, and the holes that existed were the holes we were able to use. Additionally, in building this new terrace, this had been a planted area and had relatively poor weight loading. And we also put a little green roof over the top of this canopy. So the relationships here were quite technical and had to be worked out from the beginning. There were records in 1955 and 6 of drainage into these stores that face Smithfield Street from this planted canopy. So there were technical solutions of waterproofing, insulating layers, double safe waterproofing, and then the rebuilding and planting, the building and planting of this terrace and the repair of these planters. So a complicated technical solution, which is part of why the project was so small and at a fairly high funding level. But this is the garage below, and the entry to the garage is right here, as you see from the light trace. And this whole space is really quite an oasis in the center of Pittsburgh. It was a pivotal space in the initial Renaissance 1 of Pittsburgh, which many of you may know sparked urban renewal in the United States for all its good and ills that it created. So Mellon Square, a technical solution and a maintenance and management continuing issue as the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy co-manages it with the city of Pittsburgh.
Thank you. I know I said that was going to be our last question, but one more popped up, and I think it's quite important to the success of a lot of public spaces, and that's the topic of programming in public spaces.
Right.
So if you could just talk a little bit about that, just in terms of how important it is, what to look out for, and who pays for it.
Right. Thank you. Well, in a downtown space, programming is almost the key to success. This little square now has noontime yoga as well as music and other kinds of events that are programmed in it. It's co-managed, Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy and city, and permitted for uses. So all of that is integral, which brings up one of the key topics in programming: who is organizing it and how is it being permitted, and is the permit cost, if those are allowed, equal to the work that has to happen to set up the event. I know in my work for a number of entities in public landscapes, the cost of staff doing setup and breakdown and cleanup is greater than the income. So there has to be a balancing of those aspects. The other thing about parks and public open spaces is you can't overdo it. Years ago we worked in Atlanta and the park there that was Olmsted designed, sorry, the name has jumped out of my head, had festivals every weekend, and every weekend they were in the same place on the same ground. So how does the turf survive? It's, you know, relates back to the National Mall and how the turf and soils work had to be customized in order to support the kind of feet walking on it. So the strategy that we put in place for the Piedmont Park Conservancy at Piedmont Park was to have 3 spaces that could support events and to support 3 events of a particularly large size, no more than 3 per month. So 3 events, 3 different spaces, and a week off so that smaller events could happen but not the big events. So I think there are a number of pitfalls with programming. One of them is overbuilding to suit the highest peak need. The way we conceptually think about parks is that you suit the everyday peak, the peak that happens 40 times a year, but you don't build to suit the 3-day peak. So you figure out as planners how to accommodate that 3-day peak without an undue amount of damage to the landscape by being clever and being thoughtful and understanding public transportation and not having too many cars and controlling vendors, and all the other aspects of program. So I think it's a really interesting topic. I just would want to touch on one other thing, and that is employment in parks, because all over the world the informal employment economy is growing. We haven't embraced it very much in our country and we tend to shun it, but the informal economy of vendors, you know, walk down a street in a big city and someone's hawking umbrellas in the rain. This is the kind of economy that is going to continue. So we need to, as planners, make rules and foster informal economies to the extent that it fits within the legal frameworks of our communities, so that we can allow people simple ways to uplift themselves in a society that often doesn't get you on the first rung of the ladder, but once you're on rung one, you can move up. Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Thank you very much, Patricia ODonnell, for joining us. Margaret Rifkin, if you're hanging in the background, thank you. And to the Urban Design and Preservation Division for sponsoring today's webcast. Thanks to everybody. Have a great weekend, and we will talk next time.